Hey guys, so today we'll be talking about origins and history of life on Earth. Now, this covers a lot of topics, but we're going to go slowly through sort of the major events in Earth's timeline, as well as talk about the evidence that scientists use to figure this stuff out, obviously, because it's very difficult sometimes to make some of these conclusions based on the limited information that we have. So here we have a preserved organism in amber, and we have another one here. This was a very exciting piece of news that came out this past fall, where we found actually a dinosaur tail preserved in amber, and what had been preserved along with the tail were feathers, which is very cool, which just confirms some of the hypotheses about this particular dinosaur's morphology. All right, so let's get started. We need to understand the fact that organisms share many conserved core processes and features that evolved and are widely distributed among organisms today. So there's a lot of things that are the same in all living organisms. Some of these are things like metabolic pathways, like glycolysis. Others are DNA and RNA, which we'll talk about in a second. But all living things share certain similarities. Some of this is the genetic code, DNA, RNA, that translates nucleic acid into protein structure, is essentially universal among all lineages of life. And then, of course, our metabolic pathways. We see these in almost all living things. So glycolysis is the first energy-producing metabolic pathway that is we've seen, and it's essentially in every cell on the planet. It's really important, and we need to get energy somehow. All right. We also see morphological similarities in cellular structures around the world. All cells on the planet are structured on one of two major organizational plans, and that's either prokaryotic cells or eukaryotic cells. Remember, our prokaryotic cells, they lack organelles, they have our free-floating DNA, they have a few ribosomes, but that's pretty much it. And then our eukaryotic cells are compartmentalized, they have membrane-bound organelles, and we think these arose through the process of endosymbiosis, which we've talked a lot about this year. So that's the theory that major eukaryotic organelles, like mitochondria and chloroplasts, evolved from free living prokaryotic cells that were engulfed and internalized by eukaryotic ancestors. And some of the evidence for this are the fact that mitochondria have their own DNA, or mitochondria and chloroplasts have a double membrane like many early prokaryotes did as well. All right. So how can modern experiments test hypotheses about the evolutionary impact of ancient environmental changes? And we'll talk about some of the experiments that exist for that. I want to mention the fossil record first. Now, the fossil record is really important. It's one of our most important pieces of evidence when talking about evolution and determining history of life on Earth. But the fossil record reveals broad patterns in life's evolution. We can use phylogeny in the fossil record to estimate the timing of major events in evolution, and the changing physical environment on Earth has clearly influenced the great diversity on life as we see today, because we've had a lot of different environments as Earth has gone on. At one point, we'll have a huge explosion of oxygen, which changes a lot for many organisms on Earth. And so we use geological evidence, such as like radioactive dating and banded iron patterns. But radioisotope dating allows us to establish the approximate age of our fossil evidence. So this is really useful, especially when we have degrading matter. Okay, so how did life on Earth start? We have the Earth's formation, but how did we get life here? There were several theories out there. Panspermia is one of the hypotheses. That life has an extraterrestrial origin arriving on a meteor or similar delivery system at some point. There's also spontaneous generation, or abiogenesis, meaning that living systems evolve from non-living components. And spontaneous generation was actually a very popular theory for a long time as far as anything is concerned. A lot of scientists thought it actually happened now in modern times, but we really only think spontaneous generation only ever happened once, and that was the beginning of life on Earth. So we had to first disprove that spontaneous generation didn't exist on its own. So people in their observational skills of the time would see something like a piece of meat and then all of a sudden see flies around the meat or maggots around the meat, and they thought the maggots had spontaneously generated from the meat. And so there had to be these like very specific experiments. And now we're like, well, duh, of course there weren't going to be maggots that spontaneously generated from the meat. There had to be a fly that came and laid eggs somewhere. We didn't see it. And so that's what they did. They disproved this theory. The scientist named Reddy held an experiment where he had a slab of meat. He covered one, he did not cover the other, waited a few weeks. Of course, the one that was uncovered was exposed to flies, and they laid their eggs and maggots appeared. And then the one that was covered could not get the flies, and there were no maggots. And so the maggots that appeared on the meat came in from outside. They did not spontaneously arise. Pretty obvious, but we had to have experimental evidence to make sure that that was not true. And then Louis Pasteur did a lot of experiments, but people still believe that microscopic organisms could spontaneously arise out of nowhere. And so he did an experiment as well where he prevented bacteria from growing in chicken broth by creating sort of an S-shaped tube so that the bacteria could be caught if they were airborne. So he disproved spontaneous generation as well. Oops, too far. Okay, so what we do know now is that fossil and geological evidence suggests that 4.6 billion years ago, the Earth was filled with all these gases that would give away electrons, things like ammonia, methane, water, hydrogen gas. And so these two scientists named Miller and Urey in 1955 predicted that if such gases, if they were given energy like a burst of lightning or whatever, would form organic material like sugars and amino acids and nucleic acids, which are basically the ingredients for life. So to test this, they set up an apparatus in which reducing gases were sparked with electricity, like a lightning or volcanic eruption, and then the resulting chemicals were collected. And guess what? It worked. They actually formed into sugars, amino acids, and nucleic acids, are organic compounds that really, truly are the basis for everything that is living. So here's a picture of their apparatus, a very simplified version of their experiment, and they were able to conclude that yes, it is possible to get these organic biological compounds from such conditions. So that's what they think the environment was like at the start of life on Earth. So the RNA world hypothesis is important to know. The hypothesis that RNA preceded DNA due to RNA's double function in living systems as an information storage molecule and a catalytic molecule. RNA was simpler. It's easier to incorporate into a genome. And it is assumed that RNA existed before DNA in organisms. Okay, really quickly, we're going to go through some major events in Earth's geologic history. I'm not going to ask you to memorize all of these. I do want you to take a look at these eons, though. So these first three eons are collectively known together as the Precambrian part of history, and it's about 4 billion years long. After that, we have the start of the Paleozoic, and we have the Cambrian explosion, and we have a lot of atmospheric oxygen levels going up. And we have a huge burst of life right here, but life obviously happens earlier. So this is another list of major events in history of life. Feel free to pause and take a look at that. This is in your textbook as well, I believe. Okay. So physical changes in the Earth and its atmosphere have influenced the evolution of life. New species have arisen and species have gone extinct throughout the history of life on Earth. So in the Precambrian era, when we first get life on Earth, for most of the era, life is going to consist of microscopic prokaryotes living in oceans, so aquatic, tiny life. But life first appeared about 3.8 billion years ago, and then eukaryotic cells evolved 1.5 billion years ago. And the diversity of multicellular eukaryotic cells was probably limited by low oxygen concentrations and extreme cold or glaciation, which doesn't give us a lot of room for living organisms. Okay, let's take a look really quickly at some major events in the history of life on Earth. I'm going to scroll to the bottom. Okay. 4.6 billion years ago, the Earth is formed. My Google Doc is being slow. Oh no, we skipped a bunch of important stuff. Okay, so the precursors of DNA, these self-replicating molecules, are going to form 3.8 billion years ago. After that, 3.5 billion years ago, unicellular life evolves, and photosynthetic bacteria begin to release oxygen into the atmosphere. 555 million years ago, multicellular marine organisms start to become common, and the diverse assortment of life includes different animals. All right, so fish like vertebrates evolved, invertebrates like trilobites or brachiopod and cephalopods are going to be common in the oceans. 450 million years, arthropods move on to land, and these descendants are going to evolve into insects that we know, like scorpions and spiders and mites and millipedes. In 420 million years ago, we get our first land plants evolving, which is going to really drastically change their landscape and create new habitats. And then 360 million years ago, we see the first four-limbed vertebrates move onto land. And there's a lot of life in Earth's oceans. 250 million years ago, we have Pangea. You guys know that. We have a lot of conifer forests. We have a lot of reptiles. We have synapsids, which are the ancestors of mammals. 248 million years ago, we are going to have 90% of marine life and 70% of terrestrial life are going to go extinct during Earth's largest mass extinction. 225 million years ago, dinosaurs and mammals evolved. Pangea starts to break apart. 130 million years ago, continents are starting to go to their present positions. We have the earliest angiosperms, the earliest flowers, and we have bony fish starting to diversify a little bit more. 65 million years ago, so pretty recently in our timeline, we have the asteroid hit the Yucatan Peninsula, and our non-avian dinosaurs are going to go extinct. Birds and mammals do survive. 4 million years ago, we have our early hominid named Lucy is going to be alive. The start of the Ice Age happens, many mammals go extinct, and 130,000 years ago, we have anatomically modern humans evolving. And then 70,000 years later, we have the first cave paintings and the early expressions of thought and consciousness. Okay, so let's get back to our history of life on Earth. If I can move forward. Oh, I think that's it. Okay, so we wanted to go over the major events, and that is it for our video. Thanks, guys.